The courtroom was packed. Rows of wooden benches were filled with journalists scribbling in their notebooks, cameras clicking at every movement. The jury sat still, their expressions unreadable. The air was heavy, thick with anticipation, as if the whole room was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. At the defendant's table sat Patrick Rourke, the police chief of Brentwood. He leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed, his fingers tapping lightly against the polished wood of the table. His tailored dark suit and perfectly knotted tie gave no indication that he was a man on trial for corruption, abuse of power, and the cover-up of countless crimes. Instead, he wore a calm, almost amused smirk, as if he already knew how this would end. Opposite him, Marcus Williams sat stiffly, his hands clenched into fists. He wasn't a weak man. For 2 decades, he had worn the badge with pride, faced criminals, seen the worst humanity had to offer. But right now, he wasn't a cop. He was a father, and for the first time in his life, he was afraid. A small hand squeezed his tightly. Zara Williams, 9 years old, sat beside him, her broken arm wrapped in a white cast. Her fingers twitched slightly, adjusting to the stiffness. She was still, she was quiet, but her eyes, sharp, steady, were scanning the room. She didn't belong here. A child her age should be at school, worrying about math tests or recess games. But today, she sat in a courtroom full of men in suits, men who spoke in measured voices and wielded power like a weapon. Today, she was surrounded by people who chose silence over justice. She inhaled deeply, her chest rising and falling in slow, measured breaths. Her heart pounded, but not with fear. Across the room, Rourke glanced at her. Just for a second, a fleeting look. But enough. Then his gaze flicked back to Marcus. His smirk deepened. A silent message, a reminder of who was really in control. Marcus swallowed hard. And at that moment, Zara understood something. It wasn't that Rourke was too powerful. It wasn't that justice was impossible. It wasn't even that corruption had won. Fear was the real enemy. It wasn't Rourke's power keeping everyone silent. It was the fear of what he could do. A thought struck her. If no one says anything, does the truth even exist? Her fingers curled slightly against the fabric of her dress. Would justice prevail today? Or was this courtroom just a burial ground for the truth? And the real question, the one no one dared to ask, could a 9-year-old do what the grown-ups wouldn't? 1 week earlier. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden streaks across the pavement. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of peaceful silence that made people feel safe. Zara Williams walked home from school, her backpack bouncing lightly on her shoulders. She wasn't in a hurry. Her mind wandered between the spelling test she had aced that morning and what her mom might be cooking for dinner. Then the world changed in an instant. A roar of an engine, screeching tires, a black SUV speeding straight toward her. There was no time to react. Impact. A sickening crack tore through the air as her body hit the pavement. Pain surged through her arm, sharp and immediate. Her skin scraped against the rough asphalt, the scent of burning rubber still hanging in the air. Her vision blurred. She could hear muffled shouting, but it felt distant. Her chest rose and fell rapidly as she tried to force a breath into her lungs. And then, nothing. No one got out. No brakes. The SUV didn't stop. It just kept going. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and cold metal. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, too bright against the sterile white walls. Zara lay in the hospital bed, her arm wrapped in a fresh cast. The dull ache reminded her that she was still here, still breathing. Beside her, her mother sat stiffly, one hand brushing through Zara's curls, the other trembling in her lap. At the foot of the bed, Marcus Williams stood frozen. He had seen injuries like this before. Victims left on the roadside, hit-and-run cases that never got solved. But this wasn't a case. This was his daughter. His fingers curled into fists, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. The doctor had said she was lucky. A few inches to the right, and the car would have crushed her ribs. A little faster, and he didn't let himself finish the thought. Marcus had spent 20 years as a cop. He knew what an accident looked like. This wasn't one. Someone had done this on purpose. And the worst part? He knew exactly who was behind it. 2 days later, the letter arrived. A plain white envelope. No name, no return address. Just a single sheet of paper. The message was simple. cold, unmistakable. If you show up in court, your daughter won't just break an arm next time. Marcus felt his stomach drop. His hands trembled as he gripped the letter, his knuckles turning white. They weren't bluffing. They had already proven that. His mind spun. What was he supposed to do? He had spent his entire life believing in justice, in doing the right thing. But now, doing the right thing meant putting his daughter in a grave. He wanted to scream, to storm into the precinct and drag these people into the light, to fight back. But then he looked at Zara, curled up on the couch, her arm wrapped in white, and just like that, the fight drained out of him. Justice wasn't worth her life. Zara wasn't supposed to hear, but the walls were thin. The voices were loud enough. "We have to leave, Marcus. We have to get out of here." Her mother's voice was sharp, raw with fear. "If we run, what does that teach her?" Marcus's voice was tight, strained. "That we survive." A long silence. Zara sat on the other side of the wall, her fingers gripping the blanket draped over her lap. She had always believed that police officers were the good guys. They were the ones who protected people, who stopped bad guys. But now, a cop had tried to kill her, and no one was coming to help. She glanced down at her arm, the cast stiff and heavy. A reminder. Her father, the strongest person she knew, was afraid. For the first time in her life, she saw the world clearly. It wasn't just about good and bad. It was about who had power and who didn't. The bad guys weren't hiding in the shadows. They weren't lurking in alleys. They wore uniforms. They sat in offices. They smiled in courtrooms. Her chest rose and fell steadily, but her fingers dug into the fabric of the blanket. If her father wouldn't fight this, if every grown-up around her was too scared, then maybe she had to. The air in the courtroom was thick, weighted with expectation. The kind of silence that didn't feel empty, but heavy, pressing, waiting, suffocating. The judge adjusted his glasses and glanced at the papers in front of him before speaking. "Marcus Williams, please take the stand." A rustling sound as Marcus stood. His chair scraped against the polished floor, the noise too sharp in the suffocating quiet. For a second, he didn't move. He could feel every eye in the room on him. The jury, the press, pens hovering over their notebooks, the rows of onlookers, some strangers, some families who had waited years for justice. And then, his wife. Her hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. Her lips pressed together, her shoulders stiff with tension. Finally, his daughter. Zara sat beside her mother, her small frame almost lost in the large courtroom chair. But it wasn't her size that shook him. It was her eyes. She was staring straight at him. She wasn't crying, she wasn't pleading, she wasn't even afraid. She was waiting, waiting to see who her father really was. Marcus walked to the witness stand, each step feeling heavier than the last. He had trained his whole life for moments like this. 20 years as a cop, testifying in court, standing behind the truth like a shield. He had sworn to protect and serve, to do the right thing, no matter what. But now he wasn't a cop. He was just a father. And fathers didn't make choices that got their daughters killed. He reached the stand, placed his right hand on the Bible. The podium felt cold under his fingertips. His heartbeat pounded against his ribs. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" A pause. The truth? The truth was that his daughter had nearly died. The truth was that he knew exactly who had ordered it. The truth was that the man responsible was sitting right there across the room watching him. And the truth was, if he said those words out loud, if he spoke the truth, Zara would never be safe again. His breath came slow, deep, and then he lowered his hand. The room froze. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if the entire courtroom had exhaled at once, then forgotten how to breathe. The judge's brow furrowed. He shifted in his seat. "Mr. Williams?" Marcus's jaw clenched. His hands curled into fists at his sides. He felt the eyes on him again, burning, waiting. And then he did the one thing he had never done before. He looked away. He didn't look at the jury. He didn't look at the judge. He didn't look at the press, at the families waiting for justice, at the people who had placed their faith in him. And worst of all, he didn't look at Zara, because he already knew what he'd see. The silence stretched, pulling tight like a rope. A reporter lowered his pen. A juror shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Someone in the gallery let out a slow, disbelieving breath. No one shouted. No one gasped. No one reacted in outrage. Because no one was surprised. They had hoped for the truth, but they had expected this. And somehow that made it worse. Marcus swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. This was it. This was the moment where he failed his daughter. But he told himself she would understand someday. When she had kids of her own, when she knew what it meant to be afraid for them, she would understand. Right? Would she? He didn't know anymore, and he was too afraid to find out. The silence in the room was deafening. And then something shifted. Not in the courtroom, not in the case. In Zara. She had never seen her father as weak before. But today she did. Her small fingers curled around the fabric of her dress. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't shocked. She wasn't even angry. She was just done waiting. But no one noticed. No one saw the way her shoulders squared. No one saw the way she inhaled. Once, deep, steady. Because at that moment, the trial wasn't over. They just didn't know it yet. Patrick Rourke shifted in his seat, slowly, lazily, as if this entire trial had been nothing more than an amusing inconvenience. He turned slightly toward his attorney, barely bothering to lower his voice. "Told you," he murmured. He wouldn't dare. The lawyer exhaled a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. Of course, he wouldn't. Rourke had seen this play out 100 times before. Fear always won. His fingers drummed lazily against the polished wood of the defense table. A slow, deliberate rhythm. And then came the smile. Not big, not dramatic, just the slightest curl of his lips, a silent confirmation that everything was exactly as he expected. A man like Marcus Williams, he had been so easy to break. The case was over. The truth? Buried, just like all the others. Across the courtroom, Zara sat perfectly still. She watched her father, waiting for him to meet her eyes. But he didn't. Not once. Something inside her tightened, but it wasn't sadness. It wasn't even anger. It was clarity. For days she had been hoping, waiting for him to be the man she thought he was. But now, she understood. This wasn't about what her father could do anymore. It was about what she had to do. Her fingers curled against the fabric of her dress. A slow inhale, a steady exhale. She straightened her back, and then the judge shifted, preparing to speak. The jury began gathering their notes. A bailiff moved slightly, anticipating the next call. It was over. Or at least, it was supposed to be. And then, a voice, small, steady, unshaken. "Can I say something?" The words weren't loud, but they didn't have to be. Because the second they left Zara's lips, the entire courtroom shifted. A ripple, invisible but undeniable, ran through the air. Chairs creaked as people turned, startled. A murmur moved through the audience, reporters snapping their heads up from their notes. The judge hesitated, his gavel still poised in the air, as if someone had just paused time itself. And across the room, Rourke's fingers stopped tapping. His smirk didn't disappear completely, but it stilled. His body, once so relaxed, was now just the slightest bit more rigid. For the first time in this entire trial, Patrick Rourke didn't look so sure anymore. A beat of silence. Then, laughter. It started as a low chuckle. Then it grew, rolling through the courtroom like a slow, deliberate insult. Patrick Rourke. He leaned back in his chair, shaking his head like he had just heard the punchline to a joke no one else understood. Then he turned. Not to Zara, but to the judge. This is our witness?" He gestured vaguely toward her, his voice laced with disbelief. "Tell me, Your Honor, have we wandered into a courtroom, or is this some kind of talent show?" Scattered murmurs, a few quiet chuckles. Emboldened, Rourke pressed further. "You know, I almost admire it. Theatrics, drama. You have to give them credit. It's clever." He glanced at his attorney, shaking his head, feigning amusement. "But let's be honest. Justice isn't a game of make-believe, and we're not here to play dress-up." Beside him, his lawyer remained still, expression unreadable. But when he spoke, his voice was sharper, colder, a scalpel instead of a hammer. Justice isn't child's play. A single sentence, but it carried weight. And for the first time since she had spoken, all eyes were on Zara, waiting, expecting her to shrink, to hesitate, to look away. Zara didn't flinch, she didn't cry, she didn't even blink. Instead, she lifted her chin and met Rourke's gaze head-on. Her voice, when it came, was calm, measured, unshaken. "If the police don't protect me, then who will?" Rourke's smirk flickered, just for half a second. The shift was small, almost imperceptible, but she saw it, and so did the jury. She didn't give him time to recover. If I stay quiet today, then who will be the next person to die? The question landed like a stone dropped into deep water. The ripples spread outward, touching every corner of the room. The laughter was gone. The arrogance drained from the air, replaced by something heavier. A weight, a truth no one wanted to acknowledge, but now it sat there, impossible to ignore. Someone in the jury shifted in their seat. A woman pressed her lips together, frowning. A man near the back, wearing a police badge, lowered his gaze. Even the judge, who had been impartial, who had seen hundreds of cases pass through his courtroom, exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly. No one spoke. No one moved. The silence was louder than any outburst could have been. And across the room, for the first time in his career, Patrick Rourke had nothing to say. The weight of Zara's words still hung in the air, heavy, unshakable, inescapable. No one moved. No one spoke. The courtroom, which just minutes ago had been filled with dismissive smirks and whispered doubts, now felt frozen in place. For the first time, Patrick Rourke wasn't in control of the room. But the silence didn't last, because then a chair scraped against the floor. The sound was sharp, almost jarring in the oppressive quiet. All heads turned toward the back of the room. A man was standing, Officer Daniel Harris, a veteran cop, a man who had served under Rourke for years. Someone everyone believed was loyal, unshakable, untouchable. Yet there he was, rising slowly, his hands pressing against the wooden bench as if steadying himself. His jaw clenched, his breath came slow, and then, his voice, rough, uneven, but resolute. "I have evidence." A ripple moved through the courtroom. A shift. Rourke's head snapped toward him, his smirk vanishing like a candle snuffed out. But Harris didn't sit back down. Didn't waver. He swallowed hard, glanced around the room, at the faces watching him, at the eyes waiting to see if he would falter. Then, finally, "I can't stay silent anymore." The words landed like a hammer striking steel. The room tilted. Something had broken. And Rourke knew it, because now it wasn't just a little girl against a giant. It was the first crack in the foundation. And once the first crack appears, the whole damn thing is bound to fall. The weight of the moment pressed against Marcus's chest. He had spent his whole life believing that fear was temporary, but doing the right thing was permanent. And yet, here he was, sitting, silent, watching his daughter, a child, do what he hadn't been able to do. She wasn't afraid. Not of Rourke, not of his power, not of the consequences. Marcus felt his breath catch, his heart pounded. And in that moment, something cracked inside him. For so long, he had told himself that staying silent was protecting her. But he wasn't protecting her. She was protecting him. The realization hit him like a fist to the chest. And suddenly he knew. He couldn't live with this. He had to be the father she thought he was. He had to stand. Slowly, deliberately, Marcus pushed his chair back. The sound echoed through the room. Heads turned. Rourke's eyes flicked toward him, calculating, waiting. But this time, Marcus didn't look away. He inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the silence settle over him. Then, finally, he spoke. "I will testify." A ripple of movement. Someone in the jury leaned forward. A reporter's pen hesitated against the paper. Rourke didn't move, didn't blink, but his jaw tightened. Marcus's voice grew stronger, steadier. "I have evidence." The tension in the room snapped taut, and then Marcus reached into his jacket. The silence stretched so tight it could have shattered. Every eye in the courtroom was on him now. And then he pulled out the flash drive. Small, unassuming, but deadly. He held it between his fingers, not raising it high, not making a show of it, just letting it exist, letting its presence speak louder than words. "This," Marcus said, his voice steady, "is proof that you threatened my family." Gasps, a collective intake of breath. Reporters scrambled for their notebooks. Rourke's lawyer sat up straighter. And yet, Rourke didn't move. Not at first, but something had shifted. The smirk that had lingered through the trial was gone. His hands, once so casual on the table, curled slightly into fists. Marcus let the silence stretch just for a second longer. Then he tapped the flash drive against his palm, once, twice, and delivered the final blow. And this, his voice was quiet now, controlled, deadly. "Is video evidence of your corruption." For the first time in his life, Patrick Rourke looked afraid. For the first time since the trial began, Patrick Rourke wasn't in control, and he felt it. It started as a creeping unease, a subtle shift in the air, a tightening in his chest. Then it spread, through the eyes that no longer looked at him with deference, through the hush that had settled over the courtroom, not out of respect, but expectation. The walls were closing in. Marcus had stood, the jury had listened, and now, all eyes were on him. The evidence was damning. The testimony undeniable. For the first time in his life, he was the one backed into a corner. And Patrick Rourke did not like being cornered. The tension became unbearable. Then he laughed. A dry, hollow sound, a desperate attempt to regain control. It echoed through the courtroom, but no one laughed with him. His fingers twitched against the table. His jaw clenched so tight it ached. "You think this means anything?" His voice was sharp, frayed at the edges. "You think some sob story from a little girl changes a damn thing?" His words landed flat. No one flinched, no one wavered. He scanned the room, searching for an ally, someone, anyone who would still meet his gaze. But there was no one. His loyal officers? Silent. His attorney? Stone-faced. Even the judge, who had remained neutral throughout the trial, simply stared, waiting. His pulse hammered against his skull. This wasn't happening. This wasn't how things worked. For years, he had been untouchable. He had built this city, controlled it, bent the system to his will, and yet he could feel it slipping. Everything. And then he snapped. "You think I can't handle some little girl?" The words burst out of him before he could stop them, raw and furious. A ripple spread through the room, shock, disbelief. The moment hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Zara didn't move, didn't flinch. She just watched. And that only made it worse. His chest rose and fell rapidly. His hands curled into fists. He turned, eyes locking onto Marcus. "You think you've won?" His voice cracked. "You think you can take me down?" He slammed his palm against the table, once, twice, each strike reverberating through the silent room. "I am the law in this city." The words exploded from him, louder than anything he had said before. And in that moment, Patrick Rourke sealed his own fate. The silence that followed was different this time. Not tense, not uncertain, final. And Rourke, for the first time, realized what he had just done. His own voice still ringing in the air. His own admission, spoken before a judge, a jury, an entire courtroom. His mouth went dry, his pulse thundered in his ears. He opened his mouth to backtrack, to spin it, to fix it. But it was too late. The damage was done. The judge turned to the bailiff. The signal was silent, but understood. Boots echoed across the floor. Rourke barely had time to register the movement before he felt a firm grip on his arm. Cold steel clicked shut around his wrists. His head snapped up, eyes darting wildly. Looking for help, looking for a way out. But there was none, because now he was the one being silenced. A courtroom that had once feared him now watched him fall. Reporters scrambled to write. The jury sat in stunned silence. And as he was led away, shackled, defeated, powerless, a voice cut through the air. Small, steady, unshaken. "Looks like you're not the law after all." Rourke stiffened, but he didn't turn around, because the truth was, he already knew. And just like that, Patrick Rourke was finished. The courtroom was still, not out of shock, not out of fear, but because something had changed. The silence was no longer suffocating. It wasn't the silence of oppression, of voices held captive by fear. It was the silence of something new being born. Justice. It had been a long time coming. The trial was over. Rourke was gone. And yet, Zara's eyes brimmed with tears. She turned toward her father, to Marcus, to the man who had once told her that police officers were heroes, that they were the ones who protected people, that they were the ones who stood against evil, not became it. And yet, she had almost died because of them. Her voice when it came was small, fragile, yet in the silence of the courtroom it was louder than any verdict. "I thought police officers were the good guys." A tear slipped down her cheek. She wiped it away, but more followed. Her father swallowed hard, his throat tight, his eyes filled with an emotion he couldn't name. Zara's voice cracked. But they were the bad guys. The words hung in the air, not in anger, not in bitterness, just heartbreak. A child realizing that the world wasn't the way she had been told it was. She let out a shaky breath, pressing her lips together. And then, She looked around, at Marcus, at the jury, at the officers who had once stood by Rourke in silence, and her voice steadied. But today, I know there are still good people. She turned to the man who had spoken up, Officer Harris. She turned to her father who had found his courage at last. And then, something unexpected happened. A man in uniform stepped forward. Officer Michael Reeves, a good cop, a man who had spent years looking the other way, convincing himself that staying silent wasn't the same as being guilty, that it wasn't his fight, that speaking up would cost him everything. But now, his chest ached with shame. His hands trembled as he removed his cap, gripping it tightly. His voice was hoarse when he spoke. I was afraid, too. His words barely broke the silence, but they carried the weight of years of regret. He looked down for a moment, exhaling shakily. Then, he met Zara's eyes. But I won't be silent anymore. His voice cracked on the last word, and then a single tear slid down his cheek. For years he had worn the uniform, telling himself he was doing the right thing. But today, a 9-year-old girl had done what he never had the courage to do, and it broke him. Zara didn't say anything. She simply nodded, because she understood. She had felt that same fear, and now, so had they. She took a step back, then another. Her father reached for her hand. She hesitated. Then, slowly, she took it. Together, they turned toward the doors of the courthouse. The heavy wooden doors swung open. Sunlight streamed inside, bathing her small frame in warm gold. She paused, took a deep breath, and as she stepped forward, into a world that was still broken, still flawed, but now a little more just, she was no longer just a little girl. She was something else. She was a survivor. She was a fighter. And most of all, she was the spark that had ignited a revolution. Zara Williams walked out of that courthouse, small but unshaken, and she would never be silent again. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Justice, courage, and standing up for what's right. These stories matter, and with your support, we can continue bringing powerful, meaningful content to life. So if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications to never miss another story that inspires and challenges us all. Your engagement fuels our passion. Thank you for being part of this journey. See you in the next story.